Welcome to episode number 12 of Medicine Basics. Last time I talked about physiology and anatomy in the context of my medicine, so one medicine, and I used a car as an analogy for the human body. Today I talk about prevention, maintaining health, a first episode on how we can do this, how we maintain our original and natural health. And put in simple words, how can we reduce the chance of screwing up our health? My name is Davide. I am a scientist and I work as an independent researcher. On the left, as usual, the topics I am covering today. And I will start with a disclaimer. An important disclaimer: this lesson applies specifically to healthy individuals. So if you're healthy, individuals whose body is not in a state of chronic disease. For chronically diseased people, different and or additional recommendations might apply. The first topic I want to cover when it comes to prevention is the role of stress in losing our health. I am not referring solely to the psychological stress that you, for instance, experience at work. I am talking about stress in its broader, in a broader sense. So all living beings, humans included, we are inserted in an environment. And an environment always presents with stressors. So examples I've listed here of stressors can be hostile meteorology. So even the hot weather we have now in Europe is a stressor. Morphology. We have stress from competition for food, for a sexual partner, for a house, apartment, for a promotion at work. There is stress from pathogenic microbes in the environment. And then in addition, we have many new stressors that we didn't have, let's say, 200 years ago. Things such as chemicals, artificial wavelengths, new foods. All these are stressors. They all somehow challenge our body. Now, if a living being thrives in an environment, it means his genetics, so his genome, can cope well with the stressors. So when I say his genome, I mean his genetics and the genetics of his microbes that live in symbiosis with him. So the people who thrive, the individuals who thrive, will also be the individuals which are more likely to survive. So this is natural selection. I have added here a equation. So the degree of compatibility between your genome and the environment determines how resilient we are, or an individual is, to the environmental stressors in his environment, which also means it will determine his chances of survival. So there is always an individual and the environment, nothing more, and it's the compatibility between these two that will determine the chances of survival. Two concepts which are relevant at this point. The first one is evolution. So evolution is the change that we observe from one generation to the next as a consequence of natural selection. So it's always intergenerational. In simple words, it's the process of expressing more advantageous genes for the environment that where a living being exists. And then disease is a sub process of evolution that has a goal of eliminating disadvantageous genes. So it's an expression of suboptimal compatibility or total incompatibility. Now, today, for the human species, we observe a very high disease prevalence compared to other living beings, so 30 to 50%. This is a large number, a large percentage. This is a clear indicator for an incompatibility of our genome and the environment. And since we know that the genome doesn't change at the same rate that this disease prevalence changed, we can say it is very likely, it's very probable that the changes in the environment are responsible for this disease prevalence. So if it's not the genome, it's the environment. It's the only two things that exist. Here's some philosophy. So this is a more philosophical slide. Why did this happen? Why is this so? Why don't we have progress without disease? Or why do we have progress if disease comes along? And I think at this point, regardless if one believes in a godly design or a design by nature, we have two options about how we can consciously approach the status quo. So we have progress, changes in the environment, and more disease. How can we approach this status quo? We have two options. We can either accept that this extreme natural selection is part of how things need to be, and we should trust the process, or we accept that we as humans, we are able to override environments, we and that we can potentially cause great harm to ourselves and others. I think I would assume that most people would go with option B, especially considering the damage that we are able to create in the past. If we look even at the last century with the world wars, I think everyone would go with option B. So if we put philosophy aside, every one medicine practitioner, so every practitioner that is interested in doing medicine, should have the mission to understand and reduce this mismatch. And we accept that this mismatch is most likely the cause of the suffering of the cause of this chronic disease. We also accept that 30 to 50% is an indicator for a substantial mismatch between the genome and the environment. So in a wild, in the wilderness, in a wild setting, such a high rate would only be observed in case of a massive change in the environment. So for example, if there is a fire in the forest, or a drought, or a forced migration, or when we transplant some animals in a zoo setting, in a controlled environment. So after this introduction, it makes sense, in my opinion, to say that we can maintain our health by first understanding this mismatch with our environment, and then avoiding the hazards. We promote healthy behaviors, and we monitor our health. I think we can all agree that this strategy makes sense. So this is just common sense. Now, very important, the first 2 points will be the topic of the next episode. And today I will cover the third one, how we monitor our health. So I talked about environmental stressors and that we should avoid hazards. I think this is common sense. Now, but does it mean we need to avoid all stressors? We know from evolutionary biology how external stressors have an important role in our evolution. And we also know from biology that our metabolism is programmed to work together and in response to external stressors. So we need some stressors, otherwise we don't work and we don't evolve. On the other hand, we know our current stressors are making 30 to 50% of us ill. So in general, we know in nature that it is the dose that makes the poison. So this applies to practically anything. So keeping this in mind, I think it's safe to say that too little and too much stress is likely bad. Then we know that some people get sick and others don't. And we can explain this by understanding that we have different genomes and we are exposed to different stressors. So I'm illustrating this at the bottom. I have two curves. So these are health stress curves. So we see too little stress and too much stress is associated with low levels of health. And then we have high health somewhere in the middle. And the dotted lines are the stress levels of that individual. So we have a red individual and a green individual. And we can see, for example, that the green individual has a high level of health and the red individual has a low level of health. This because the green individual is more resilient to stress, so his curve goes more right. He can handle more stress because of his genetics and the genetics of his microbes. And he also has less stress in his life. On the other hand, the red individual has higher levels of stress and also is less resilient, and we see how his health is on a much lower level. So this could apply to one particular stressor, if we talk about one stressor, this curve, but it can also apply to the sum of all stressors. So we want to keep the stressors at a optimal level, somewhere in the middle. So you can see for the green one, it's fine. His health level is quite high. It's almost at the highest point. But also, if he increases his stressors, it might be dangerous because he doesn't have so much resilience on the right side. Yeah. So as mentioned previously, I will cover these hazards quickly here. I'm going to talk about them in the next episode thoroughly. This is just to make you familiar with these. So how can we avoid? What are hazards that we can avoid or that we should avoid? As I said, we don't need to avoid them completely. Some level of stress is fine. Too little and too much is dangerous. It's harmful. So we have avoid raising kids unnaturally. We have avoiding sedentary lifestyle, avoiding too much comfort, avoiding unnatural food options, avoiding toxic wavelengths, avoiding toxic social pressures and conditioning, avoiding bad relationships, avoiding excessive hygiene, avoiding toxic chemicals, avoiding chronic stressors in general, so work, relationship, poverty, and then consider avoiding vaccination and medications. Same here with health promoting behaviors. I will cover these in the next episode. Here I'm listing a summary to start making you familiar with these. So we have sleep and moving enough, exposing yourself to nature, being part of a happy community, living in the moment, eating locally and seasonally, and understanding and living your sexuality. These are a few points on promoting health. Now let me present about when and how we should monitor our health. So where I'm from in Switzerland, we aren't taught any clear recommendations about this. These are recommendations I think we can all agree on based on what we have learned so far. So different biolayers that we can approach, and also common sense, especially when it comes to the periodicity. Also, remember that our current medical practice bases diagnosis on pathological values, not on disease processes. We don't want this. We want to potentially stop, recognize, and stop any pathological process as soon as possible before damage has progressed to the point of producing pathological values. So let me start. Always, always work on becoming more aware on how the environment affects your health. So how sleep, how food, how activities, how thoughts, how mood, how weather, other stressors affect you and your health. It's an important point because we saw that phenotypes and symptoms are is a biolayer. Then once in your life, you should get your DNA sequenced. You can use 23andme.com. It's 150 to 100 US dollars. I will explain why in a moment further down in this presentation. Then once a year, I recommend getting your biochemistry tested. So you can order these tests yourself or ask your physician to order these tests for you. I also recommend a urine test together with biochemistry test, and I'll explain later why and where to order these. Then in addition, you should order at least a blood test whenever you start to feel different than your usual self. So something is wrong, you feel different than your usual self, you should consider getting a biochemistry test at least. Monitoring how I feel. So we saw this is the phenotype layer of life, conscious mind. This is probably the best indicator for how your health is doing, as long as you're in tune with your body. If you feel off, and if you feel off, sometimes it happens that your doctor dismisses your symptoms because he thinks your tests are normal, even though you have symptoms. This is a big mistake. This because a symptom is always a sign of disease. It just means your practitioner is not able to find and or understand what is going on in your biochemistry. A very important point here is that chronic diseases often develop slowly over a longer time period. So you should always pay attention how your health develops over time, even longer periods. So if you start noticing, for example, or if you start noticing that you feel more fatigued, that you need more sleep, that your hair is thinning, that you're having more frequent viral fungal outbreaks, these are all signs of a compromised immune system, a tired immune system that is using up a lot of your energy. This means that potentially it's possible that you're developing a chronic disease. Monitoring blood biochemistry. Blood chemistry can both be more and less sensitive than your symptoms, meaning that disease is sometimes recognized before you have symptoms. So it can be recognized in your blood markers before you have any symptoms, but it can also be the other way around. You can have symptoms before your doctor notices anything in your blood values. In my experience as a researcher and as a patient, you should make sure to cover at least the following markers in your biochemical analysis. At this point, um, I need to say that I could obviously make a presentation on every single marker here, but here I'm giving you a practical summary. So let me go through these quickly. CBC is the most complex one. It gives information on the cellular component of your blood, how healthy your red and white blood cells are. So it's not difficult to learn to read this test. It's a set of markers, and it's a good indicator for overall health. Chronic disease usually worsens these markers towards an anemic situation. So keeping track of your original markers is also something that makes sense, or to just know what your markers are at a healthy level is very useful. Then we have vitamin D. This is a prohormone which we either get from sun or we absorb from animal foods. Vitamin D plays a central role in regulating the immune system. This value should never be low. If it is low, make sure to raise it, ideally naturally through sun exposure. I'm listing it because many neurodegenerative and autoimmune diseases, but also some cancers, are associated with low vitamin D levels. So this might be an indicator for a chronic disease, especially if this value is very low, and especially if you're having a hard time raising it. Then we have HSCRP, so high sensitivity CRP, C-reactive protein. This is an acute phase protein that will be activated when there is inflammation in your body. It's a general marker for inflammation. A value higher than 0.5 milligrams per liter is definitely too high. Then homocysteine is a marker of inflammation in our blood vessels. Ferritin can be useful to identify a lack of iron, so causes of anemia. If it's low, if it's high, it can be an indicator for, especially associated with low CRP, it can be an indicator for a subclinical intestinal inflammation and infection. Then liver biochemistry is a set of markers. It's useful to identify poor and compromised liver function. All these tests are cheap. So if they are not covered by your insurance, you shouldn't pay more than around $150 at most. You should be able to get them for between 50 and 100. I've also included here a hormone testosterone for males, in particular because I have found it to be a good marker for overall health. So if this is on the higher side, it's a good marker for wellness. So the GI microbiota is another layer that we can monitor. We understand the symbiosis with the microbes in our gastrointestinal tract, plays a central role in our overall health. In particular, we now understand that the microbes in our GI modulate our immune system. We understand that mitochondria rely on healthy GI microbiota. We are discovering that many drugs are working by affecting the microbiota and not how initially hypothesized directly on their organ physiology. we are finding associations between chronic diseases and compromised microbiota and or mitochondria. We therefore can say environmental factors influence the host or the microbes inside of us. We cannot really say which one is affected first at this point. What we know is that these two parts are in symbiosis, so our body and our microbes work in symbiosis. So a weakening of the one leads to the weakening of the other. This is the basic idea behind a symbiotic relationship. So this effect takes place through the different axes that I mentioned in previous lessons. So the gut-brain axis in particular. So monitoring the GI microbiota is still a relatively new thing. It is a very active area where, with more and more services coming out and a lot of research going on, and it is possible to sequence the entire microbial DNA, the microbiome. This, however, is still quite expensive and gives results which are difficult to interpret, and it's difficult to formulate clinically relevant therapies from it. So instead, today I would still recommend a urine organic acid test. This is a test that analyzes metabolites in the urine, so metabolites of the microbiota. So metabolites are products of metabolism. So this microbial mass is active, has a metabolism, and basically we analyze the product of metabolism. So this analysis yields information on the most commonly observed pathogenic dysbiotic states. So this analysis is available all over the world and costs between 200 and 350 US dollars. This test also gives valuable information about mitochondrial health and the gut-brain axis, so neurotransmitters. Human genome. So with genome, in this case, I'm referring exclusively to our genetics, the DNA included in our 23 chromosomes that we inherit from our mother and father. The DNA codes, as explained previously, codes for enzymes, which are proteins. These proteins regulate our metabolism. What we know is that we have identified different bits in our DNA or in DNA that are associated with certain disease states, or also that indicate metabolic weaknesses. I have mentioned in past lessons how DNA matters less than what genes are expressed. So the epigenetics is more important than the genetics itself. What is expressed changes from time from this is not something static, it's dynamic. So considering all this, I recommend everyone should get their DNA sequenced, not for personal interpretation. I'd really think twice before looking at any report based on your DNA, especially when it comes to disease predispositions. But you will always have this information ready. So in theory, addressing your metabolic weaknesses encoded in your DNA can help prevent diseases, yes, and you can use this to speed up your recovery in case of disease. However, at this point in time, I wouldn't recommend preventive approaches based on your DNA analysis, just because we don't have enough information. So, what are action points if we want to start proactively caring for our health? We have monitoring our health. So, how? First of all, we become more aware on how the environment affects us, our health. Then we learn the basics of medicine, and or we find a practitioner who practices one medicine, or something in this direction. This is probably the hardest task. Right now, your best chance is probably to look for a functional medicine practitioner, um, but it could also be an open-minded physician. Ideally, of course, every one of us would have someone in our community who practices one medicine, a person that can help us responsible for the health of the entire community. And maybe you can become that person, given the fact that you are here. Then I recommend ordering a one-off genetic test through 23andme.com. This is a saliva test. Then test your biochemistry once a year, ideally in the same period at the start of the year, I would recommend. And also order a urine test. I recommend ordering the urine test at Great Plains Laboratory.com, as they offer their services to international customers. So this is very convenient. Any functional medicine practitioner or any naturopathic doctor should be familiar with these tests. Then go do an on-demand test, so a blood biochemistry test, and at least maybe a urine test whenever something doesn't feel right, especially if you notice your fatigue increased, your sleep worsened, and you have less energy, you have more fungal and viral outbreaks. And then, of course, very important action point is to watch the next lesson and to apply what I will explain there. And remember that it's not a matter of reducing all the stressors, it's always the dose that makes the poison. So this was it. I hope you appreciate how what I recommend here is simply to look at the different layers of life, so different biolayers, so we can get a better understanding of our overall health, not just at blood biochemistry and ignoring all the rest, because scientifically it's incorrect or it's unnecessarily limiting. Then what is crucial in this lesson that I want you to make sure that you understood well is that is the role of stressors in evolution, so in the evolution of our species, but of any species, and that too little and too much of any stressor will be detrimental to our health. And take action, the actions that I have listed in the action plan, and I think that's it. So I hope to see you in the next episode. Thank you for watching.